It was one of those nights when the rain wouldn't let up, a cold, relentless downpour that soaked everything in its path. I had just finished a long day at work, the kind that left me drained, physically and mentally. The humid air of the city seemed to close in on me, making me feel claustrophobic despite being outside, as if the night itself was closing in. I was late, running late to be exact. The train ride was usually my time to unwind, to block out the madness of the city and just sink into the rhythmic clatter of the subway. But tonight, nothing seemed to go right. The rain had been coming down in sheets, causing a cascade of traffic jams, turning the normally efficient New York City streets into a crawling mess of honking cars and frustrated commuters. I was used to the unpredictability of the city, but tonight felt different. I was exhausted, my nerves frayed from the day's challenges, and now the rain seemed like the last straw. My usual calm had given way to a bubbling sense of dread. I reached the subway station with only a few minutes left before the last train. I wasn't sure why I cared so much. It wasn't like the apartment was much of a sanctuary anyway, but there was something about that train ride, the routine of it, that made me feel like I was still tethered to something normal in the midst of the chaos. I sprinted up the slippery steps of the station, my dress shoes barely holding on to the slick concrete, heart pounding in my chest. I could hear the unmistakable sound of the train's horn in the distance, a reminder of just how much time I had wasted. Every muscle in my body screamed as I threw myself down the staircase to the platform. The doors were starting to close, but somehow, through sheer luck, I managed to grab the pole at the rear car and haul myself inside just before they slammed shut. The moment the doors closed behind me, I let out a long, shaky breath. I pressed my back against the cool metal of the door, my hands resting on my knees as I tried to slow my heartbeat. I looked around, my exhaustion pushing me into a dazed state of mind. The train was empty. Not a soul in sight, which was strange for the last train of the night, but I didn't think too much of it. The rain was tapping against the windows in a soft, rhythmic beat that somehow calmed me, and the chill air that rushed through the car helped to clear the fog from my mind. For a moment, I simply stood there, letting the sounds of the train and the rain mingle together in a hypnotic pattern. There was something soothing about it, something that made me feel as though the world was moving, but I was momentarily still. The train's constant hum vibrated through my bones, lulling me into a half-daze. My eyes grew heavy. The next thing I knew, the train had stopped. My eyes shot open, but before I could fully comprehend what was happening, the doors slid shut again, and the train began to move. The sudden motion was jarring, and I blinked several times to shake off the grogginess. Something was off. The train was now packed with people. The car that had been empty just moments ago now seemed completely full, every seat taken, people standing, some leaning against the poles. I was confused. I hadn't heard anyone board the train, not a single footstep, not a single sound. How had they all gotten on without me noticing? My mind raced, trying to piece it together. I blinked again, trying to focus. The woman sitting across from me caught my eye. She was staring at me with a strange, intense gaze. Her lips were pursed, but she didn't speak. She looked familiar, but I couldn't place her. I glanced around, my heart starting to race. Something wasn't right, but the exhaustion weighed on me. I closed my eyes, wanting to slip back into sleep. When I opened my eyes again, the train car was empty. Completely empty. The eerie silence hit me like a punch to the gut. No sound. No people. Not even the rustling of clothing or the murmur of voices. The train hadn't stopped. It was still moving. My breath hitched as I scanned the car, my chest tightening. The smell, something faintly burnt, almost metallic, clung to the air. I frowned, my stomach churning. My gaze moved from the empty seats to the back of the car. And that's when I saw him. A man, sitting at the far end of the car. My pulse quickened. The man was casually puffing on a cigarette, his face obscured by the smoke, the glowing ember of the cigarette the only thing visible. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. My gut instinct screamed at me to get away. "Hey, you're not supposed to smoke in here!" I called out, my voice unsteady. The man didn't respond immediately. He took another long drag, exhaling the smoke slowly, the gray mist curling up toward the ceiling. My skin prickled with unease as the man turned his head and glanced at me. His eyes were dark, hollow, as if they held some deep, unspoken knowledge. I moved closer. "Did you see all those people? Where'd they go?" The man's lips curved into a twisted grin. He chuckled softly, the sound low and gravelly, as though he had heard this question 1,000 times before. "You're new, huh? I've been riding this train for 30 years, pal. Midnight rolls around, and this car? Let's just say folks don't stick around for long." I frowned, a sense of confusion mounting. "What are you talking about?" I asked, though my voice wavered slightly. The man shrugged, as if indifferent to my skepticism. "Think what you want. A year ago, I was sitting right where you are now. Dozed off like you did. Woke up to see someone sitting across from me, reading a newspaper. Thought it was weird, who reads the paper at 1 a.m. But then he lowered the paper." His voice trailed off as he took another drag from his cigarette, his eyes narrowing. I felt a cold shiver snake down my spine. "What happened?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The man exhaled, shaking his head. His face, it was messed up. Crushed on one side like someone taken a sledgehammer to it. Blood dripping down one eye all. The man paused, inhaling sharply. His face twisted into a grimace as he flicked the cigarette away. "Anyway," I screamed. "Thought I was losing my mind. But then he just fixed himself. Like nothing ever happened. Told me I looked like I needed a drink and handed me a bottle of water." I stared at the man, my blood running cold. I opened my mouth to say something, but no words came out. Before I could speak, the man added, "I'm just saying, you better stay awake. Things get strange when you fall asleep on this train." A jolt of panic surged through me. The train rattled into the next station, and my gut instinct screamed at me to get off, to leave this strange, unnerving ride behind. But my legs felt like lead. My body refused to move, frozen in place by the creeping sense of dread that had taken root in my chest. As the doors closed and the train started again, I glanced at the man, who was no longer sitting in his seat. Panic clawed at me. I looked around frantically, but the man was nowhere to be found. My heart raced as I scanned the train, every inch of it seeming to close in on me. Then, through the fog of my panic, I caught sight of something that made my blood run cold. The man was standing at the door, staring at me. My breath caught in my throat. I froze. I couldn't move. Couldn't even blink. My eyes locked onto the man's dark gaze as the train sped on, the sound of the wheels grinding against the tracks almost deafening in the tense silence. Then, with a sudden, unnatural fluidity, the man stepped off the moving train. I was still frozen, my body numb with shock. My heart slammed against my chest as I stared at the spot where the man had just been. I couldn't believe what I had just seen. The man had stepped off the train, at full speed. Impossible. Yet, the tracks beneath me remained empty. No sign of the man. Then, as if my mind had betrayed me, a voice whispered from behind me. "Forget something?" I whipped around, my heart nearly stopping. The man was holding out the same bottle of water, that twisted grin still on his face. The very same bottle from the story the man had told me. The bottle I had never seen until now. The world seemed to tilt. My vision blurred, and the air around me grew thick with the weight of something unseen, something unfathomable. The train continued to rattle down the tracks, but for me, it was as though time had stopped. It was late, well past 2 in the morning, when my boyfriend and I were driving back to my house. The streets were empty, bathed in the eerie glow of streetlights, the kind that make everything look slightly off, casting long, stretched-out shadows that seemed to move on their own. The night was humid, clinging to our skin like a second layer, making us drowsy despite the occasional burst of wind from the open car windows. We had spent the evening at a friend's place, nothing out of the ordinary, just some late-night TV and conversation. But as we approached the final stretch of road before my house, something made me sit up straighter, my drowsiness evaporating in an instant. There, on the side of the road, was a man. At first, I couldn't quite make sense of what I was seeing. He was kneeling, but his head was pressed to the ground at such an unnatural angle that it made my stomach twist. He was bent forward, his forehead nearly touching the pavement, yet his face was turned toward the street, fully visible in the dim light. I inhaled sharply. "Did you see that?" I asked, nudging my boyfriend's arm. He had already started slowing down, his knuckles tightening on the steering wheel. "Yeah." We pulled up a few feet ahead of him, and I hesitated before stepping out of the car. I glanced at my boyfriend, who was just as wide-eyed as I felt. Neither of us spoke. I swallowed hard and opened the door. The moment I stepped onto the pavement, the night seemed heavier, like a thick, oppressive weight pressing down on me. I moved cautiously toward the man, my breath coming out in short, uneven bursts. My skin prickled as I got closer. His eyes were open. Wide open. They were glassy and unfocused, yet somehow pleading. His face was slick with sweat, his clothes damp with it, clinging to his hunched form. But it wasn't just his posture that was unnatural. It was the stillness. He didn't blink, didn't twitch, didn't react to my presence at all. I crouched beside him, my heart hammering. "Sir?" I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I reached out, hesitating just before my fingers brushed against his arm. Cold. Ice cold. Every hair on my body stood on end. He wasn't shivering, wasn't moving at all. I swallowed the lump forming in my throat. I couldn't see his chest rising or falling. My breath caught. He wasn't breathing. I pulled my hand back, my skin still tingling from the unnatural coldness of his body. "I don't think." Before I could finish, a noise startled me. A sharp rustling sound. My boyfriend had gotten out of the car, his sneakers scuffing against the pavement as he walked toward me. "Is he okay?" he asked. I shook my head, unable to form words. Something about this felt wrong. Deeply, deeply wrong. "We need to call someone," I finally managed to say, stepping back. My boyfriend nodded quickly. "Let's go. We'll call from your house." We jumped back in the car and sped the remaining blocks to my house. As soon as we got inside, I grabbed the phone, my fingers shaking as I dialed 911. 911, what's your emergency?" I exhaled sharply. "There's a man on the side of the road. I don't think he's breathing. He's just kneeling there. His head is on the ground in this weird way, and he's ice cold. I think he's dead." The dispatcher's tone remained calm. "What's your location?" I rattled off the intersection as my boyfriend hovered next to me, eyes darting toward the front window. We half expected to hear sirens immediately, but the street outside remained eerily silent. "We're sending officers now," the dispatcher assured me. "Please stay on the line." A few minutes passed in tense silence before the police arrived at the scene. Then, after what felt like an eternity, my phone rang. I lunged for it. "Hello? Ma'am, are you sure about the location?" the officer asked. I frowned. "Yes. We just left there 10 minutes ago. He was right on the side of the road." There was a brief pause. "We don't see anything." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What?" "There's no one here. No sign of anyone." "Are you sure he was?" "I know what I saw," I interrupted. "He wasn't breathing." "He was." I stopped myself. My pulse pounded in my ears. There was no way he could have moved. No way. Unless someone took him. Or something did. "All right," the officer said finally. "We'll keep checking around. If you remember anything else, call us back." I hung up, my hands shaking. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I checked the newspapers, expecting some mention of an unidentified body found near that intersection. But there was nothing. No police reports, no missing persons alerts, nothing. Over the next few weeks, I kept checking. I called the police again to follow up, but they had no record of anything strange that night. It was as if he had never existed. My boyfriend and I talked about it a few times after that, but eventually, we just stopped. It was easier to let it fade into the back of our minds, to pretend it hadn't happened. But every so often, I find myself thinking about that night. About his wide, unblinking eyes. The silent, desperate plea on his frozen face. And I wonder, did I see a man who had already died? A ghost, trapped in his final moment? Or was it something else entirely? Something that didn't want to be found? I'll never know. And that's what scares me the most. The morning shift at the supermarket always had an eerie stillness to it. Before the doors opened to the public, the aisles were silent, the only sounds being the hum of the refrigerators and the occasional squeak of my trolley's wheels as I moved from shelf to shelf, replacing old price labels with new ones. It was a monotonous task, but I didn't mind it, at least not until this past Wednesday. I was working in the personal care aisle, kneeling in front of the shelf of hand soap, peeling off outdated labels and sticking on the fresh ones. The fluorescent lights above buzzed faintly, their harsh white glow casting long, sharp-edged shadows along the linoleum floor. It was just another morning shift, until it wasn't. A loud clatter shattered the silence, and I jerked upright. About 2 feet away from where I was working, a bottle of hand soap had shot off the shelf and landed in the middle of the aisle. Not tipped over, not knocked slightly forward, it had been flung outward as if someone had thrown it. My heart pounded as I turned my head slowly toward the empty aisle. At the far end, my colleague Sophie, who was restocking toothpaste, looked up at me. She raised an eyebrow and shrugged. "Happens all the time," she said nonchalantly before turning back to her work. Her words sent a chill through me. All the time? I stared at the bottle, lying there, perfectly intact, as if waiting for me to pick it up. Cautiously, I approached and lifted it. It wasn't wet or slippery. There was no reason it should have moved at all, let alone with such force. I tried to brush it off. Maybe I'd bumped the shelf without realizing it. Maybe there had been a vibration from a delivery truck outside. But even as I placed the bottle back in its spot, a gnawing unease settled in my gut. The following morning, I arrived at the store just as the security shutters were rolling up. The manager unlocked the doors, and I stepped inside, inhaling the familiar mix of cold air and the faint scent of cleaning chemicals. As I made my way to the back, passing the aisles, something caught my eye. Items, dozens of them, were scattered across the floor. Boxes of cereal, bags of chips, bottles of shampoo, all lying in the aisles as if they had been swiped off the shelves in a frenzy. Sophie arrived a few minutes later and took one look at the mess. "Jesus," she muttered. "It's worse than usual." "Usual?" I asked, an edge of nervousness creeping into my voice. She sighed. "Yeah, stuff's always out of place in the mornings. At first, I thought it was just customers being messy before closing, but—" She trailed off, rubbing her arms as if she were cold. "I started noticing how some things are in the exact same spots, day after day. Always in the middle of the aisle. Like they're being placed there on purpose." A shiver ran down my spine. "Have you ever seen anything? Like actually seen it happen?" Sophie shook her head. "No, but I've heard things. Whispers sometimes, when I know I'm alone. And once—" She hesitated, glancing around as if to make sure we were alone. "I swear I saw someone standing by the freezers. Just a shape barely there. But when I looked straight at it, it was gone." I swallowed hard. I wanted to tell her it was just her imagination, but the memory of that soap bottle shooting off the shelf stopped me. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. The idea of something lingering in the store, unseen but active, made my skin crawl. I decided to do something I had never done before: check the security cameras. The next morning, when the manager wasn't paying attention, I slipped into the back office and pulled up the footage from the previous night. I fast-forwarded through the early hours, watching as the overnight stalkers worked, the janitor mopped, and then, nothing. The store was empty. Then, at exactly 3:14 a.m., the shelves in aisle 5 trembled. Not a vibration. Not a subtle shift. The entire row of items shuddered, as if an invisible force had run its hands along them. Then, one by one, bottles of hand soap actually lifted, off the shelves and dropped onto the floor. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead. There was no one there. No one at all. And then, just before the footage cut off, I saw it. A shadow. Tall. Thin. Watching. Not a trick of the light, not a passing reflection. A figure, darker than the surrounding shadows, standing at the end of the aisle. And then, it stepped backward, into nothingness. I slammed the monitor off, heart hammering in my chest. My breath came in short, shallow gasps. That wasn't just a glitch. That wasn't my imagination. Something was in the store. That night, I stayed behind after my shift. I told myself I needed to see it for myself, to prove I wasn't going crazy. The store closed at 11 p.m. By midnight, the only people left were me and the janitor, who worked in the back. I stood in aisle 5, gripping my phone tightly, waiting. At exactly 3:14 a.m., the air changed. It grew colder. The humming of the lights dimmed to a whisper. My breath misted in front of me. And then I heard it. A rustling. A faint scrape of movement. I turned my head slowly, my stomach knotting with fear. And there, at the far end of the aisle, it stood. The shadow from the footage. Tall. Motionless. Watching me. A suffocating silence filled the space between us. My fingers trembled as I reached for my phone, but the second I blinked, it was gone. Except, it wasn't. A whisper, so close it brushed my ear, "You shouldn't be here." I spun around, heart pounding. Nothing. But the shelves behind me. All the items had been cleared. The floor was littered with bottles, boxes, and cans, as if something had swept them all away in an instant. I ran. I didn't stop until I was outside, gulping in the crisp night air, my hands shaking. I never told my manager what I saw, but the next morning I quit my job. And now? Now, whenever I pass by that supermarket, I can't help but glance through the glass doors. Because sometimes, just sometimes, I swear I see someone standing in the aisles, watching.